In the summer of 1943, Anna stood at the edge of her village, a once thriving community now reduced to rubble. The air, thick with smoke and the scent of burning wood, seemed to suffocate the remnants of her past. Her childhood home, a modest stone house nestled at the foot of a green hill, had crumbled under the weight of artillery fire. All around her, the silence of devastation was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of war machines and the occasional cry of a fellow refugee lost in the chaos. Anna's heart was heavy with a grief so profound that it felt like a physical ache. Her parents were gone, their fates unknown, likely taken by the very soldiers who had marched through their streets just days earlier. Her brother, a young man barely out of his teens, had been conscripted into a resistance group, and though she hoped he had managed to escape, she had no proof. He could be alive, or he could be among the many bodies that lay scattered across the region, victims of a brutal conflict that spared no one, not even those who simply wanted to live in peace. The village was empty now, save for the displaced and the broken, those who had survived the bombings and the raids but were left with nothing. For Anna, the war had always felt like a distant specter, something that only existed in the pages of history books or in the stories of older generations. But now, the war was all-consuming, tearing apart everything she had ever known. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and the ground was no longer stable. Every day, she woke up to a new form of horror, whether it was the sight of Nazi soldiers parading through the streets, the air thick with the tension of occupation, or the desperate looks of her neighbors, once proud and self-sufficient, now reduced to beggars. Her world had shrunk, become a labyrinth of danger and uncertainty, and survival no longer seemed guaranteed. As the bombs fell around her, Anna had learned the most brutal lesson of all. Kindness was a luxury that war could not afford. She had witnessed firsthand the cruelty of the occupying forces, soldiers who saw civilians as nothing more than collateral damage. The propaganda that had seeped into her mind as a child, the notion that Germans were to be feared, had been proven true with a force more terrifying than she could have imagined. They came with rifles and orders, tearing through villages with a precision that left no room for humanity. When they found someone who had dared to resist, the consequences were swift and severe. No mercy, no compassion, only cold, calculated punishment. There were those who tried to fight back, of course. Resistance groups had formed in the shadows, operating in secrecy, hoping to sabotage the occupiers and buy some time for their people. But Anna knew the futility of such actions. The Germans always found out. The reprisals were horrific, and for every act of defiance, there were dozens of families who paid the price. Her own village had seen its fair share of such retribution, with innocent lives lost in an attempt to resist forces far beyond their control. But as the years passed, even the small hopes for a sudden end to the occupation began to fade. The war was no longer something to wait out. It was the new reality, one that altered the very fabric of life. The news from the front lines was grim. Each day, it seemed, another town had fallen, and the scope of the conflict grew ever larger. Europe, once a land of great culture and history, had become a battlefield, a place where the very essence of civilization was being torn apart by ideologies that saw people as pawns in a grand game of power. It was then that Anna, like so many others, made the fateful decision to flee. There was no longer any safety at home. Her village had been marked, its inhabitants treated as expendable by the forces that ruled the land. Every night, the sky was filled with the haunting sound of distant bombs and the crackle of machine gun fire. It was not a matter of hope anymore, but survival. She couldn't stay here, not with the German forces closing in on the remaining pockets of resistance, not with the very fabric of society disintegrating around her. The world as she knew it was gone, and in its place was a dark, cruel force that left nothing but ruins in its wake. She packed her few belongings, just a small bag with a few clothes, a photograph of her family, and a little money she had managed to scrounge up, and set off toward the western border, where, she had heard, there might still be a chance of escape. Anna had no illusions about the journey ahead. She knew it would be long, perilous, and fraught with danger. Every step would bring her closer to an uncertain future, but it was better than the certainty of death if she stayed. She didn't know where she would end up or how long it would take, but she had to try. It was the only choice she had left. The first few days were the hardest. She traveled by foot, through fields and woods, avoiding major roads where Nazi patrols were known to roam. She had no map, only the whispered directions of other refugees who had passed through the same route before her. At night, she would hide in the underbrush, listening to the sounds of the war that seemed to be closing in on her from every direction. The cold was unbearable, and the hunger gnawed at her insides, but it was the fear that was the hardest to endure. Every sound, every shadow in the dark, could be a threat. Every person she met on the road was a potential enemy or, at best, a stranger who might offer little help. Her trust in others had been eroded by years of occupation, and she knew that the kindness of strangers could not be relied upon. In her mind, the world had become a place where survival meant accepting cruelty, for cruelty was all that was left. There were no longer any illusions about the goodness of people, only the harsh realities of survival, where betrayal was as common as a handshake and empathy was a forgotten concept. But Anna kept moving, driven by the hope that, somehow, she would find a place where she could rebuild, where the nightmare of the war could finally be left behind. Even if that place was nothing more than a distant dream, it was a dream she had to chase. The alternative was surrender, and surrender was something she refused to consider. The road stretched endlessly before Anna, a barren ribbon cutting through an unforgiving landscape, and the further she walked, the heavier the weight of her decision to leave her village pressed down on her. It had been days since she left, but the landscape around her seemed to reflect the tumultuous state of her mind. Each step she took was another nail in the coffin of her old life, but she had no choice. She couldn't stay in the village any longer, not with the war tearing it apart, not with the constant fear of soldiers marching through her home. Her once idyllic world, full of the laughter of neighbors and the familiarity of daily routines, had been shattered, replaced with something unrecognizable and hostile. The journey was proving far more grueling than she had imagined. Anna's feet were sore from the constant walking, her shoes, already worn down by the harsh conditions, barely providing any protection against the rough terrain. Her body ached with exhaustion, and her stomach growled constantly from hunger. She had nothing but scraps of food she had managed to salvage from abandoned homes or from sympathetic strangers, when she was lucky enough to find them. Often, though, food was a luxury she couldn't afford, and the hunger gnawed at her insides relentlessly, a constant companion that reminded her of how little she had left. Every time she passed another village, another settlement that had fallen to the war, she felt the same crushing weight of loss. These places had once been filled with life, people who laughed, who worked the land, who raised families. Now they were ghost towns, hollowed-out shells where the echoes of the past were all that remained. Some villages had been bombed to the ground, while others had been emptied by the Nazis, their inhabitants either killed or taken away to labor camps. She avoided the remains of these places, for fear that they were still dangerous, that they might be crawling with soldiers or Nazi sympathizers. Anna was used to moving quietly now, learned to slip through places unnoticed, always on alert, constantly fearful. Her senses were sharper than they had ever been before. Every rustle in the brush, every movement in the distance, caused her heart to race. She couldn't afford to make any noise. The Germans had eyes and ears everywhere, and the slightest slip could mean capture, or worse. She had learned quickly that trust was a commodity in short supply. No one could be relied upon. Everyone, no matter how kind they seemed, had their own survival to think about. It wasn't that she hated the people she met on her journey, it was just that she had no room for sentiment. Compassion had become something foreign, something that belonged to a past life. The first time Anna encountered another refugee, she didn't know how to react. The woman, middle-aged and gaunt with hunger, had appeared on the path just as Anna was resting beneath the sparse shade of a half-dead tree. She had approached cautiously, eyes scanning the surroundings, before addressing Anna with a hesitant voice. "You're alone?" she had asked, as though the very notion of being alone in these times was too dangerous to fathom. Anna had nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't want to engage. She didn't want to trust anyone. The woman, however, had persisted, offering a piece of stale bread wrapped in a rag. At first, Anna had rejected the offer, instinctively suspicious. The woman could have been working for the enemy, or worse, she could have been a thief. But after a long moment of hesitation, she accepted. There had been no real choice. She was starving, and the thought of walking another mile without something in her stomach was unbearable. As she chewed the bread, she found herself staring at the woman, who seemed strangely familiar, like someone who had suffered the same pain she had. The kindness the woman offered was small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet it struck Anna deeply. She had learned not to expect kindness from others. She had learned to distrust anyone who showed even the smallest amount of care. Yet here was this woman, offering her food without asking for anything in return, simply because she knew what it felt like to suffer. That was the first of many encounters that would change Anna's perception of the world. But it wasn't just the food the woman offered, it was the unspoken understanding between them. For the first time since her escape, Anna felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: connection. A fleeting recognition that, perhaps, even in a world so consumed by war and hatred, there was still a small measure of humanity left. That moment, brief as it was, shifted something inside her. It didn't erase her fear or her suspicion, but it began to break down the walls she had built around her heart. Days turned into weeks as Anna made her way westward, traveling through forests and fields, avoiding towns and villages where German patrols might be lurking. Her legs grew weaker with each passing day, and the weight of the journey bore heavily on her. The further she went, the more desperate the situation became. She began to question whether she was making the right decision. The world was so much darker than she had ever imagined. There were no safe havens, no guarantees of protection. Every encounter was a potential threat, and every step forward was a step into an unknown future. Yet, despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, Anna could not bring herself to turn back. The thought of returning to her village, to the life she had once known, was impossible. The war had taken everything from her: her family, her home, her sense of security. Even if she made it out alive, she could never go back to that life. It had been destroyed, and with it her old self. The person she had been before the war was gone, buried beneath the rubble of her village, and she had to keep moving forward because there was no other choice. As the weeks dragged on, Anna's hunger grew more insistent, gnawing at her with each passing day. She had lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely from her thin frame. The nights were the hardest. She could never sleep well, always too anxious to rest deeply. The nightmares haunted her, visions of her family, of her brother, of the village they had all once known. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being chased, that the war was closing in on her, suffocating her with its relentless presence. Despite the overwhelming fatigue, Anna kept going, relying on the few skills she had learned from her father, who had taught her to hunt and forage in the woods as a child. She found solace in the quiet of nature, in the rhythm of her own movements as she searched for food or shelter. It was a small comfort in a world that had become foreign to her. One evening, as she walked along the edge of a forest, Anna saw a group of soldiers in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat as she ducked behind a cluster of bushes, instinctively holding her breath. She had no way of knowing whether they were German or Allied, and she wasn't willing to take any chances. She watched them for what felt like hours, waiting for the right moment to slip away unnoticed. The soldiers were talking among themselves, their voices low but audible. She caught a few words, their accents unmistakable: British. The realization hit her with a rush, a sense of disbelief flooding her chest. She wasn't entirely sure what it meant, but it was something she had been longing to hear. She was closer now to the western border, to a place where there might be hope, where perhaps she could finally find refuge. But the uncertainty still loomed. The British soldiers weren't there to save her. They were fighting a war of their own. Still, the knowledge that she was nearing a place where she might find safety filled her with a faint but growing sense of hope. Anna continued on her journey, each day a battle with the elements, with her own body, and with the demons of fear and doubt that whispered in her mind. She was terrified, exhausted, and alone, but the promise of something better kept her moving forward. She could feel the weight of the past lifting with each step, but she was not yet free. She didn't know what awaited her at the end of this journey, but she had come too far to turn back now. The first sign of relief came when Anna crossed into British-controlled territory. It wasn't the welcoming sight of a thriving village or the bustling streets of an occupied town, but rather a quiet checkpoint along the road, manned by soldiers she had only heard of in whispered conversations, British soldiers. She had seen their uniforms from a distance during her travels, but up close, they were like ghosts from a distant world. These were men who fought against the very forces that had destroyed her home, who had resisted the Nazi occupation that had devastated her country. For the first time in weeks, Anna felt a surge of hope, tempered with a deep wariness she could not shake. Her eyes flicked over the soldiers as they moved about the checkpoint, checking the papers of refugees and giving terse instructions to the few civilians who had managed to make it this far. Anna stood on the outskirts, uncertain whether she should approach, her instinct for self-preservation urging her to stay hidden, to remain unnoticed. She had no idea what would happen if she stepped forward. Would they see her as just another refugee, or would they view her with suspicion, a potential enemy in disguise? She had been betrayed before by those who promised safety, and the cruelty of the world had taught her to trust no one. But these were different men, and for the first time in a long while, Anna considered the possibility that they might be different. With a deep breath, she walked forward, her steps tentative, as if testing the ground before her. The soldiers barely acknowledged her presence at first, too busy with their tasks. But then one of them, a tall man with a heavy coat and a face that seemed both weary and kind, looked up and met her gaze. His eyes lingered on her for a moment before he straightened, his expression shifting from the blank detachment of someone used to the war's everyday grind to a softer, more human recognition. "Are you traveling alone?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with an underlying concern that surprised her. Anna nodded slowly, the words of her response caught in her throat. She had grown so used to silence, to communicating with just gestures and glances, that speaking felt like a betrayal of her own fear. "Where are you headed?" the soldier continued, not pushing, but his gaze still insistent. "I don't know," Anna replied, her voice a low whisper. She couldn't bring herself to give a definitive answer, couldn't commit to any direction. She was just moving, just trying to survive, and beyond that, everything was a blur. The world around her had been reduced to one constant act of running from the past, from the nightmare that had unfolded back in her village, from the certainty of death. She had no map, no plans, no idea where she would go or how she would get there. The soldier seemed to understand. He motioned for her to follow him, his tone gentle but firm. He led her toward a small area just outside the checkpoint, away from the bustle of the soldier's duties. For a moment, she hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a trap? Was he going to arrest her, interrogate her, or worse? But the soldier didn't seem threatening. He didn't look like a man with a hidden agenda. He wasn't an officer barking orders, nor was he the cold-eyed enemy she had encountered so many times before. There was something about his presence, something reassuring, that made her want to trust him, even if only for a moment. Once they were out of earshot of the others, the soldier handed her a small ration pack, a tin of beans, a piece of hard bread, and a chunk of cheese. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had eaten in days, and the sight of food almost made her cry. She hadn't realized how desperate she had become until the warmth of the food in her hands made her stomach twist with hunger. It was more than just sustenance. It was a reminder that kindness, even in the midst of such brutality, was still possible. "Eat," the soldier said quietly, his gaze softening. "You need to keep your strength up." Anna didn't hesitate this time. She sat down, her legs trembling with the effort of simply staying upright, and began to eat. She devoured the food quickly, almost greedily, as if she feared it would vanish before she could swallow it. The soldier didn't watch her. Instead, he sat a few feet away, his back to her, giving her space. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of her chewing and the distant chatter of the other soldiers. The simplicity of the moment felt like an illusion. Here she was in the middle of a war, surrounded by soldiers and refugees, but for the first time in a long while, Anna felt a flicker of safety, something that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in what seemed like an eternity. Once she had finished the food, the soldier spoke again, his voice breaking the silence in a way that felt almost intimate. "Where are you from?" he asked. She looked at him, startled by the question. It wasn't just a casual inquiry, It felt like an invitation, a recognition of her as an individual, not just as a nameless refugee. It was a question she hadn't heard in so long. She could hardly remember the last time someone had cared enough to ask. "I come from a village," Anna said, her voice small. She looked down at the dirt beneath her feet, as if the earth could swallow her words. "It doesn't exist anymore." The soldier said nothing for a moment. His silence, instead of feeling cold, seemed to acknowledge the enormity of what she had just shared. He didn't ask any more questions, didn't press her to tell her story, but there was a quiet understanding in the way he looked at her. Anna found herself grateful for that. She didn't want to relive the horrors of her village, of the screams, the explosions, the chaos that had swallowed everything she had ever known. She didn't need to tell him about the bodies, the fire, or the families dragged from their homes and executed in the streets. He didn't need to hear about the terror of the last days in her village. It was something she could never speak of aloud. "Your journey's not over yet," the soldier said, breaking her thoughts. "But it's safer here for now. There's a camp not far from here. It's not much, but it's better than wandering." Anna hesitated. A camp. It was a word she had heard before, spoken in hushed tones by other refugees, places of refuge, but also places of uncertainty. She wasn't sure if she was ready for more uncertainty, but something about the soldier's words gave her hope. At least in a camp, she wouldn't have to be alone. "I'll take you there," he added, standing up and offering his hand to her. For a moment, she stared at his hand, unsure of what to do. The idea of relying on someone else, of trusting another person after everything she had been through, was still foreign to her. But she had no other choice. She couldn't keep running forever. She had to accept help, even if it meant exposing herself to vulnerability. It was the first time she had felt the weight of someone else's care in weeks, and it was both terrifying and comforting at once. Anna slowly placed her hand in his, a gesture that felt both tentative and necessary. With a gentle tug, the soldier helped her to her feet. She was weak, but with his support, she managed to stand tall. As they walked toward the camp, the soldier told her nothing about what lay ahead, no promises of safety, no reassurances that all would be well. But his presence, steady and unspoken, gave her something she hadn't had in a long time: hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe there was still kindness in the world, even in the darkest of times. The camp, though modest, was a world apart from the destruction Anna had witnessed in her village. It was a place of refuge, but it was not a sanctuary. The rough tents and makeshift shelters were organized in rows, scattered across a field of dirt and grass, and surrounded by barbed wire. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their figures casting long shadows as they moved from one watchtower to the next. The sound of clanking metal, the murmur of distant conversations, and the creaking of wooden crates filled the air. The atmosphere was heavy with both hope and resignation. This place, while safer than the roads and villages she had fled, was still a reminder of the world outside, a world defined by its unpredictability, where the line between life and death was razor-thin. As they entered the camp, Anna felt a sense of dislocation. It was the first time in weeks that she had been in the company of others who weren't soldiers, and it was overwhelming. There were men, women, and children, all displaced by the war, each with their own story of loss and survival. Some had the blank, faraway eyes of those who had seen too much, others wore their fear openly, while still others seemed determined to hold on to some semblance of normality, clinging to routines and habits that felt like distant memories in the face of such chaos. The soldier led Anna toward a small group of refugees who were huddled around a fire, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. There were no signs of the brutal violence she had grown accustomed to. Instead, there was a quiet solidarity among them, a shared understanding that everyone here had been through something unthinkable. The soldier nodded to them, as if offering some unspoken reassurance, before turning to Anna. "You'll be safe here for now," he said, his voice low but firm. "The officers here will help you. They'll make sure you're looked after." Anna nodded, but a small knot formed in her stomach. She had heard rumors of camps like this, places where people were shuffled through like cattle, where survival depended on the kindness of strangers, but also on the willingness to forget the pain of the past. She had no illusions about what such a place could be. Even here, there was still a chance that something could go wrong, whether it was the capriciousness of the guards, the jealousy of others, or the endless uncertainty that came with being a refugee in wartime. The war had stripped everyone of certainty. It had replaced it with a fragile hope that was always overshadowed by the fear that things could take a turn for the worse at any moment. As the soldier turned to leave, he gave her a final look, a look that was both kind and distant, as though he, too, was aware of the fleeting nature of the safety he was offering. "Get some rest," he said simply, before walking away, blending into the shadows of the camp. Anna stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her own exhaustion settle into her bones. She was hungry, thirsty, and emotionally spent, but the physical fatigue was nothing compared to the emotional strain that threatened to overwhelm her. There was no place left for her to run, no immediate danger pressing on her, but the war had made her wary of peace. It had taught her to question every act of kindness, to measure every gesture of compassion against the possibility of betrayal. She had learned to keep her distance, to protect herself from the pain of getting too close to others. But here, in this camp, something inside her began to shift. The people around her were not the faceless soldiers who had torn apart her world, nor were they the hollow-eyed refugees who had become nothing more than shadows of their former selves. They were human beings, struggling to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. And despite the hardships, despite the fear and uncertainty that clung to the air like smoke, there was a quiet sense of community, a fragile bond that held them together. That night, Anna lay beneath a threadbare blanket in a small, cramped shelter, trying to sleep. But sleep, as it had for so many weeks, eluded her. Her mind was filled with the sounds of explosions, the cries of the wounded, the flash of flames as her village had burned. She could still see the faces of her family, her friends, their expressions frozen in terror. She had left them behind, unsure of whether they were dead or alive, and the weight of that uncertainty gnawed at her, preventing her from finding any kind of peace. The camp was quiet, but not in the way a peaceful place should be. There was no laughter, no joy to be found here. It was a place of survival, a place where people clung to the hope that, somehow, things might get better, even though they had no way of knowing what the future held. Anna's thoughts turned once again to her family. Her brother, whom she hadn't seen since the early days of the occupation, had disappeared into the resistance, and she had no idea whether he had survived. She had no way of knowing what had happened to her parents. The uncertainty was a constant ache that she couldn't shake. As the days passed, Anna began to find a rhythm in the camp. The work was monotonous but necessary. She helped with small tasks, washing clothes, gathering firewood, or preparing food, anything that would take her mind off the painful memories that refused to let her go. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but there was a small measure of peace in the routine. The work kept her from sinking too deeply into despair, from being consumed by the loss that had defined her existence since the war began. It was in these small moments of routine that Anna began to notice something she hadn't allowed herself to see before: the kindness of others. She met a woman named Elzbieta, an older lady with weathered skin and a warm smile. Despite her own suffering, Elzbieta always had a kind word for Anna, always made sure she had enough to eat. She had lost her children and her husband in the early days of the war, but her spirit seemed unbroken, and her resilience was something Anna found both inspiring and humbling. Elzbieta never asked Anna about her past. She simply offered the comfort of her presence, a silent solidarity that spoke volumes more than words ever could. One evening, as the camp settled into its quiet routine, Elzbieta came over to Anna, holding a small bundle of herbs. "For your sleep," she said gently, handing her the bundle. "It helps. You need rest, child." Anna looked at her for a long moment, and something in her chest tightened. She had not expected this. No one had ever shown her such care without wanting something in return. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It meant that she wasn't invisible, that her suffering hadn't gone unnoticed. "Thank you," Anna whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words felt foreign, as if she had forgotten how to express gratitude, but she meant them deeply. As the days turned into weeks, Anna began to open up, just a little. She shared more with Elzbieta, telling her about the horrors she had witnessed, the journey that had brought her to the camp. And in turn, Elzbieta shared her own story, her own grief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to create a bond between them. Anna didn't feel quite as alone anymore. She began to understand that, perhaps, this was what the world had come to, the survivors, the broken people, finding ways to hold each other together, even in the absence of everything they had once known. Still, the fear never fully left her. The war was never far from her thoughts, and the possibility that the camp could be overrun, that they could be forced to move again, was always lingering in the back of her mind. But the people in the camp, these strangers who had become her new family, gave her a small measure of hope. They showed her that even in the darkest of times, humanity had a way of finding the light. Every day was a struggle. Every day brought new challenges, new fears. But with each passing day, Anna found herself holding on to something she had long abandoned, hope. It was fragile, a delicate thing that could be broken with a single blow, but it was there, flickering in the faces of the people around her, in the kindness that had been extended to her when she had expected nothing but cruelty. Slowly, Anna began to understand that, perhaps, this was what it meant to survive, not just physically but emotionally, mentally. It was about holding on to the small moments of kindness, the flickers of light in a world that seemed to be drowning in darkness. And in that there was strength. Days turned into weeks, and Anna's life in the camp began to take on a strange kind of routine. There were no longer the moments of frantic panic that had once consumed her, no sudden raids, no soldiers on the hunt. The oppressive fear that had followed her from village to village, from one day to the next, had become a dull, constant hum, always present but no longer paralyzing. The camp, for all its imperfections, had become a place of relative safety, and this in itself was a form of relief. Yet there was something unsettling about the fragility of this peace. She could see it in the eyes of the people around her, refugees who had lost everything, trying to rebuild their lives piece by piece. But there was no escaping the knowledge that everything could be taken away again at any moment. Anna didn't dare let herself believe that the worst was behind her, not fully. The war was still raging, and the world outside the camp was just as uncertain as it had always been. In the mornings, Anna would rise early, before the sun had fully risen, and join the others in the camp for the daily tasks. There was always something that needed doing. Wood had to be gathered for the fire, clothes had to be washed, meals had to be prepared. The work was hard but not demanding, and it kept her mind occupied. It was easier to focus on the mundane tasks than to think too deeply about the horrors of her past or the uncertainty of the future. She had grown used to the camp's rhythms, the daily ebb and flow of life that, for all its hardships, provided a semblance of order in a world that had been turned upside down. Anna found comfort in the small moments of routine. She would stand by the fire with Elzbieta, watching the smoke curl into the sky as they prepared their meager meals. The older woman had become something of a surrogate mother to her, offering guidance and quiet companionship when Anna needed it most. They never spoke of the past too much, only the present. They shared stories of their lives before the war, of the things they had lost, but always in a way that seemed to acknowledge the impossibility of returning to those days. The past was a different world, one that no longer existed, and to cling to it would be to deny the reality they were living in. In a sense, they both understood that the only way forward was to accept the present, with all its uncertainties, and to make do with what little they had. One day, as Anna sat by the fire, a thought struck her, a thought that she had pushed away for so long. It was a question she had never allowed herself to ask, not out of fear of the answer, but because it seemed so impossible, so distant. But now, with the passing days and the fragile peace that existed in the camp, the question felt urgent. What if I could start over? What if, somehow, amidst the wreckage of her life, there was a way to build something new, something that wasn't defined solely by loss and survival? The question was foreign to her, a spark of hope that had not existed in her heart since the war began. The thought terrified her. It wasn't that she didn't want to live again, to find a new way forward. But it was the weight of it, the realization that to even entertain such a thought meant letting go of the past, of everything she had known and loved. It meant allowing herself to hope, to trust again, and to open herself to the possibility of something better, even if that something was uncertain and fragile.